And now we're on Chaf Aleph Amid Beis. Taner Rabbana, we learned in a brisa, continuing with the salting of karbonos. Melach shal gabi ha'ever mo'olimbo. Shal gabi ha'kevesh v'sheberosh mizbech ein mo'olimbo. So we have a principle called me'ila, which generates a chiyuv of keren v'chomesh and an ashamilus if accidentally, inadvertently, you took from something that's kodesh and you enjoyed the benefit of it. And with regard to melach, what's the situation of a melach? So it all depends. If the melach was already used on a carbon, then we have a principle called nases mitzvah. So the mitzvah was already fulfilled, and that removes the iser me'ilah. And that's going to be the cases of al gabi kevesh. They used to do salting on the ramp that led up to the mizbeach. V'shabarosh mizbeach, other salting they did on the top of the mizbeach itself. And if there was an excess amount of salt, so some of the salt, somehow spilled off, got shooken off the limb of the carbon, it's already nasis mitzvah, and there's no me'ilah. But if there's melach on top of the aver, it's on top of the limb, then there's me'ilah. And this doesn't make any sense at all, because if it's on top of the limb, then it's already nasis mitzvah. So the Gemara is going to say, Omar of Masa Maikra, that this is not a logical conclusion. This is something that we derive from biblical exegesis. It's a scriptural requirement, it's Exeris HaKosuv, and it defies all the principles that we know about Me'ilah. And it's based on the future, the prophetic description of Yechezkel of the future Beis HaMikdash, the third Migdash. And that's going to be a pasuk in the 43rd chapter of Yechezkel. There's a lot of halachas that we learn from Yechezkel about the Migdash. Many of them make no sense whatsoever. Just be careful if you derive any conclusions from Yechezkel. Anyway, it says there, "V'kravtem l'fnei Hashem v'shlichu hakohanim alei melach v'helu osam ol Hashem." Now take a look. There's a description here of the carbon that already has melach on it. It has salt on it, right? Because it says his shlichu, etc., melach alei melach, and yet it still calls it Ol Hashem at the end of the pasuk. It's still a carbon. So it means that the salt becomes part of the carbon. And if it becomes part of the carbon, then it generates a chiv me'ilah. And this, this is something that we'd have to take up if we're learning Masechta Me'ilah, because you see that there are situations of nasis mitzvaso, and yet this still generates me'ilah. That has to redefine me'ilah for us. Tanana Hasan, we learned in a Mishnah. I believe that this Mishnah is in Masechta Shkolin. And now we're distinguishing between private property and communal property. What do I mean by communal property? Every year, each Jew had to bring a machzis a shekel, half a shekel, and that went into the Trumas Halishka, meaning that went into a certain pot of money that was used and dedicated for communal sacrifice, for karbonos tzibur. So the question is, what about melach and what about eitzim? Does the Kohen take, let's say the Kohen who wants to be makriv of his own carbon, and he has eitzim, he has trees, he has salt. Can he bring his own salt? Or must the salt come from the Trumas Halishka, from the publicly owned salt? And the Mishnah says in Masechta Shkolim, Al Melech V'Al Eitzim Sheyuga Kohanim Ne'osim B'hem, meaning that the Eitzim and the Melech are privately owned by the Kohen, and therefore there's no Me'ilah. Me'ilah only applies to something that belongs to the entire, to Hegdish as an entity. Amar Shmuel says, wait, don't take this too far. Lo shanu el karbonam. If you're talking about salt that was brought by the Kohen from his own house for the purpose of his carbon, meaning to salt his carbon, that I can understand. Avalachila, but let's say You want to claim that the salt is privately owned by the Kohen, and therefore, when he's eating his corn on the cob at home, he can salt it with that salt and eat that salt. What's going on here? Because Halkadat, the Gemara thinks that you know what's going on here. Ma'ila korbanom lemloach korbanom, and what is la'achila? It means achilas kachim. It can't mean achilas chulin, because you can't use the salt that was dedicated for karbonos and use it to salt your corn in the cob. Impossible. And now the Gemara says the following: the only way, therefore, of justifying Shmuel's point is to assume that although it's permissible to use your personal stock, storage of milach for your carbon, but nevertheless, when you eat the carbon, right? Because even kachim kalim can be kachim can be eaten by the Kohen, and the Kohen now wants to salt the kachim that he's eating. Donna, you're listening to this. It's very important for the Kohen to know. You're getting a piece of the carbon, you're eating it, and you want to salt it. Again, you have to eat it in the Azara, and the salt is going to add to the taste. Comes along Shmuel, says, no, you can't do that. Impossible. Says the Gemara, that's an untenable position. Yes, the Kohen can use the salt for eating the carbon. As we're going to soon prove that when the Kohanim get their portion of the oros, of the hides, they can salt the hides, tan them with salt, even though the salt is right there in the mikdash. Is then lachilus kochim lo yavina? If you're allowed to use it to salt the hides, and how much more so the great mitzvah of achilas hakochim, achilas hakarbonos, which the Gemara says, by the way, the atonement, the kapara of the bala korban is generated by the achilas hakohanim. So how much more so can we allow him to use the salt for the achilas kohanim? And I'll prove to you that you're allowed to salt the oros, the hides, from a brisa. The Sanya we learned to the brisa, nimtzeis ata omer v'shlosha makomos hamelech nesuna. When they stored the salt in the area of the mikdash, it was in 3 different lishkaot. Lishkaot are offices. Number 1, the lishkas hamelach, right? And we thought that the lishkas hamelach would be enough to store all the salt. No. V'al gabi kevesh. They used to keep salt on the ramp. Apparently, they did salting of the karbonis, the limbs of the carbon, as the Kohen went up the ramp to bring the limbs from the carbon after shechita onto the pyre on the mizbeach. They would do salting, so they kept salting there on the ramp. They probably had a special, little booth or something. And barosh shel mizbeach, there was salting that was done even on the top of the mizbeach. So now the Brisa explains, Belishkas Hamelech, what did they do with the salt that was stored in the chamber of salt? Sham Molchim Oros Kajim. That's where the hides that were given to the Kohanim would be tanned with that salt. And you see clearly that the salt could be used for tanning the hides that are owned by the Kohanim. Al Gabi Akevesh, why did they store salt on top of the ramp? Shesham molchim haivarim, as we said before, berosh shel mizbeach shesham molchim hakometz vehalavona. The kometz and the lavona of a korban mincha were brought on top of the mizbeach, and then they were burnt on the pyre of the mizbeach. Before you burnt it on the pyre of the mizbeach, you're already now on top of the mizbeach. You added the salt. U'minchas kohen. Now, the Kohen who brings a korban mincha, it's kulo kol, it's completely burnt on the mizbeach. Minchas Kohen Mashiach is also completely burnt. Minchas Nesach is completely burnt. All the is completely burnt. And although a mincha that's brought by Yisrael, right, which there the kmitza is matu the shirai fachila, not in the case of minchas Kohen. And minchas chavitim, that's what it refers here, Kohen Mashiach, on a daily basis, once in the morning, once in the evening, I should say the afternoon would be more precise. It was entirely burnt on the Mizbeach, and the same is true for the Minchas Nesachim. Anyway, we see one thing from this brisa, that you're allowed to use the salt for tanning the hides of the Kohanim, and therefore it makes sense to say that if the Kohanim are eating the karbanos, the basar karban, then they can apply salt. So what does Shmuel mean when he says that la'achila, it's also, you can't use the salt for achila? Elamai lekarbanam. Let's go back to the word lekarbanam. And we're going to say that that is referring to the eating of the Kohen of the parts of the karban, the limbs of the karban that he's allowed to eat la'achila karbanam. Umay la'achila, what does he mean to exclude when he says he can't use the salt for his achila? Achila is chulin. Whoa. The Gemara is saying that the Bryce is coming to tell me that when he eats his korban, his what do we call it, the corn on the cob in his dining room, he's not allowed to use salt from the mizbeach, from the kodesh. Frek the Gemara pshita. Why would I ever dream of taking the salt from the mikdash and bringing it to his dining room table? My boy Hassan. Furthermore, says the Gemara, you're not allowed to take it out of the Azara. I'm sorry. You're not allowed to take chulin into the Azara. So in other words, he's doing the salting in the Azara of what? Of chulin? There's no chulin in the Azara. You're not allowed to bring chulin into the Azara. So the Gemara says, why do we have a havamina that he can take the salt and use it for his chulin? Afal gav diomar yochlu. She yochlu ima chulinu truma. There's a mitzvah in achilas kodshim of alasova, meaning the Torah says that the Kohanim should be eating the kodshim like kings. A king doesn't eat because he's famished, but rather he eats when he's pretty much full, but he enjoys a little extra dessert over there, and that's called alasova. We know it from the Lala Pesach, from the Korban Pesach. That's why we have an afikomen. Now, in the context of eating alasova, we might entertain the possibility that he could use the salt in order to enhance his achila alasova. Again, it's going to be a strange kind of situation. He's going to do the salting outside of the Azara, but he's going to eat the basar karban that's now salted inside the Azara. He can't eat, he can't take the chulin inside the Azara. That's a no-no. But that kodshim, which he has a mitzvah to eat in the Azara, he's going to salt it, and then he's allowed to eat truma. Okay, so he's going to eat truma to fill up his belly, so that when he eats the basar kodshim, he's not, it's not like gluttonously eating it. And now he's even going to eat chulin to fill up his belly. So therefore, since he's doing it as part and parcel of the mitzvah of achilas kodshim, so that he'll eat kodshim ala sofa, therefore we might think that he's allowed to use the salt. Let me just see if he adds anything here. Just 1 second. Although it's forbidden to bring chulin into the Azara, we still need to teach that the melach of the kodesh may not be used with chulin food, meaning outside the Azara, on account of those instances which the chulin is consumed in order to induce a feeling of satiety, of svia, before eating kodshim. One might assume that since the chulin is eaten for the sake of the kodshim, therefore we can use this melach. So Shmuel therefore finds it necessary to state that the permission for the Kohen to use the temple salt with the sacrificial food does not extend to chulin. Amalei, Amalei Ravina. Liravashi, Hochinami Mistarba, this is logical. To Isa Kedaikamai Korbanom Limloach, right? Is timer the Asne Bezdin. I don't get it. We said that Bezdin has to make a Tanai in order to allow him to use the salt. Holo Asni, implying that if there was no Tanai of Bezdin, there was no stipulation on part of Bezdin, then the Kohen would not be allowed to use the salt. I don't get it. Hashtal Yisrael Yavinon, or Yisrael, who's not a Kohen, is allowed to use the temple salt for purposes of eating the kodshim. Is the Kohanim lo Yavina, would it entertain our mind that if the Bezdin did not make such a Tanai, then the Kohanim would not be allowed to use it? So therefore we have no choice but to assume that when Shmuel speaks of Karbanos, he's referring not to the Karbanos of the Kohanim. Desanya, we learned to the Brisa, Yochel ha'omer arelai mincha yovi melach mitoch beso. Maybe if a person takes upon himself a pledge to bring a korban mincha, he can bring melech from his house. Kiderch maybe levona mitoch beso, because he's allowed to bring levona from his house. The dinu, and it's logical to assume so. Nemar have mincha v'have melach. We have two psukim that both are almost identical, and they say mincha and mel, bring a mincha. V'nemel havi mincha levi levona, and with regard to levona, mal levona mitoch beso, af melach mitoch beso. So at this point, the Gemara thinks in the Brisa that if he wants to bring salt from his house, not in the case of levona, but even in the case of bringing salt for a mincha, he's allowed to do so by virtue of the parallel to levona. Oh, the Brisa now offers another possibility that klach go down a different road. L'derech zu. Nemar havei mincha vei melach. V'nemar havei mincha vei eitzim. Ma eitzim mishal tzibur. Af melach mishal tzibur. Right, all the eitzim, all the wood that was used for the karbanos in the mikdash were brought from the Trumas Halishka, and I might think that now melach, it's not enough that he brings melach from his house, but for the korban he has to bring melach that's purchased from the Lishkas Trumas Halishka. Therefore, we have two ways of interpreting it. We have to choose which one is more logical. It doesn't make sense to compare it to levona, because levona is not brought in all the karbanos, and yet when it comes to salting, it's all karbanos, and wood is used for all karbanos. Oh, I have another way of doing it. Klach l'derech zu davar haba, done in davar haba ima b'kliyechad mi davar haba ima l'kliyechad. Right? The law is that the levon has to be brought together with the mincha in one kli shares. V'al yochichu eitzim, and don't compare it to eitzim. Sheinam boim ima l'kliyechad. Talmud Lomer, now we need a pasuk to determine which way to go. Bris melech olam he. The salt is called bris melech olam. Lahalanu Omer, another pasuk says me'es b'nei Yisrael bris olam. See that bris olam is coming from the Bnei Yisrael, meaning the communal ownership of the Trumas Halishka, Malahal Mishel Tzibur, Afkan. So to here, with regard to the salt, it's got to come from communal funds, and therefore the Kohen cannot bring his salt from his house. Anyway, we see clearly that from this brisa, that basically the Yisraelim are allowed to use the temple salt for their karbanos, and therefore, with a kal v'chomer, the Kohanim are allowed to do so. So therefore, says Ravina, it must be that the need for this stipulation on the part of Bezdin to allow the Kohanim to benefit from the temple salt refers not to the burning of their offerings, their karbanos, but rather the consumption of the achilas kodshim. Amalei Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi Hachi Ka'amalei Rav Shisha Bereder Rav Idi Lo Nitzcha El Ben Buchri. Right, this Tanai of Bezdin that allowed the Kohanim to benefit from the salt of the Mikdash is only needed according to Ben Bukhari, because his opinion is that Kohanim did not have to bring a Machzis HaShekel. So what's the problem? If according to Ben Bukhari, there's no Chiyuv of Machzis HaShekel on the Kohanim, then you have a problem because the Snan, Rabbi Yehuda Heid ben Buchri b'Yavna kol kohen sheshokel eno chote, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lo ki ela kol kohen she'eno shokel chote ela kohenim dorshim mikras eli atzman. Okay, so there's a whole issue here about the kohenim, whether they're chayiv to bring shkolim or they don't. And if you assume that, like Ben Bukhari assumes that kohenim did not have to bring a half a shekel for the machzah shekel, then we have a problem. Why? Because since the salt has to come from the Trumas HaLishka, it has to be owned by the tzibur. Now what's going to happen is that the ownership of the salt accrues also to the kohenim, but the kohenim don't have to chip in for the machzah shekel. So in a sense, they have private ownership over the salt, and that's not acceptable. Okay, we'll stop here, and Mr. Shem, tomorrow we'll pick up this whole piece about shkolim, which is like a separate piece in the daf. Okay, then, so have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow about noontime.